Cause you're listening to Jams and Tea, you won't see the show on your TV, so we talk about things musically. Cause you're listening to Jams and Tea, you're listening to Jams and Tea.
Welcome everybody to a brand new episode of the Jams Tea Podcast, where we spin the jams, spill the tea, and today we're talking about a record club episode. And now we're going to talk about Tyler's recommended album this week, which is Inside by Orbital. Tell us about why you wanted us to listen to this record.
What the fuck is an orbital, right? I'm here to answer your questions. Orbital are a UK electronic music act formed in the late 80s and had their most significant period of relevance throughout the 90s. Orbital were a group or a duo, because it's two people, Phil and Paul Hartnell, who are brothers. And I grew up with their music ever since before I can remember. I've been listening to Orbital, and that's because my dad loved Orbital, and they were kind of hitting their stride and hitting some of their most acclaimed music in the period before I was born. And we're going to talk about one of those records today, obviously. But they were a very influential and important act in the UK electronic music scene during the 90s. And their music has persisted, even if fewer people are sort of familiar with them now, and they don't necessarily have the lasting cultural or continuing cultural relevance of your other big UK electronic music acts like your Autechers and your Aphex Twins and all of that sort of jazz. And also a lot of the electronic music we've talked about on this podcast can fit into the realm of IDM, which is a very specific subtype of electronic music defined by quite specific characteristics, whereas Orbital doesn't really fit into that group. Orbital are a part of a different sort of related, because it's all happening in the UK in the early 90s, but slightly different sort of aspect of electronic music, in that they are a part of the techno world and the acid world, and a lot of the kind of rave stuff that would balloon into some of the big beat music of the late 90s and early 2000s, and acts like the Chemical Brothers and the Prodigy, who also were huge musical focal points in my really early life. But Orbital were my first favorite band, and they remained that, like, when I was 5, and they remained that for a long time. They were one of the most
fucking Tyler thing I've ever fucking heard in my life.
Yeah, well,
people be listening to the Wiggles when they're 5, and you're just like, fucking, I'm into Orbital, and it's just like, who let this child in here?
Hot potato, cold spaghetti,
The games of tic-tac-toe on the playground must have been wild with Tyler.
It wasn't like I was into them. It's just like that they were the thing that got the most positive response from me when my dad put it on.
Sure, but it's hilarious when I say it.
Yeah, no, yes. Totally. And my dad still has a bunch of their records on vinyl and CD, Insides on vinyl and cassette tape, incidentally. And actually, I think a bunch of the records on cassette tape as well, which is a really cool way of experiencing Orbital, actually, as I'm sure August can imagine as a cassette fan. And this being the kind of analog electronic music that very much comes out of the cassette era. Anyway, I'm digressing heaps here. So Insides, the album we're talking about today, is the 4th Orbital album. And in many ways, it is their crowning achievement. It is the moment where all of the different sort of sonic templates that make up Orbital, that come out of the techno and acid techno world of the early 90s, fuse into this kind of almost progressive statement of clear musical intent and cohesive execution. There's no filler on a record like Insides. It is a cohesive and consistent statement from front to back. In its original form, it is 6 pieces, 2 of them split in half on the CD and subsequent releases, but I see it as a record of 6 pieces. My fear kind of going into this, because we have talked a lot about electronic music in terms of the IDM scene as opposed to the techno scene. And my fear in terms of having fed you so much late 90s, 2000s Autechre and Square Pusher and stuff like that is that maybe I've conditioned you to expect entirely original and forward-thinking sounds from electronic music. And this is certainly a forward-thinking record in its own way, but it is also very clearly a 90s record in sound and texture in a lot of respects. In many ways, it shares some DNA with it's closer in DNA to groups like the Orb. And okay, the name similarity is quite obvious there as well, but like their early records as well have a similarly kind of sweeping, progressive, lengthy, jammy feel. So it's easy to date insides to this era, but I think unlike something like Autechre's first record, Incannabula, for instance, the datedness of this does not detract from the music for me in any way. And if anything, it enhances it. You're hearing sounds, many of which you can hear in loads of other artists from this era, but you're hearing them be combined in a way that feels really progressive and original. It's pushing the limits of what these textures can evoke, and in many respects is making all of these sounds feel like this is the record they were made to be on. And it's an absolute marvel of musical construction as well. This is one of those records where it's mixes where sounds are just layered on one by one by one until you've got this cathedral-like combination of all of these interlocking rhythms and melodies and counter melodies that are all gloriously singing together. I've given enough context now, I think, and I've sort of spoken about the place that this record belongs to, I think, step back and save my extended thoughts and for last, as we typically do on Record Club. And I want to hear from you guys about, especially if you've come at this record as being kind of unlike anything else you've heard before, or being sort of like different to what you expected or not having a particular expectation. How did you experience this record? How does it sound to you? Does it work? Does it cohere? What is your experience with this album?
Yeah, if no one else is going to go, I'll go. Although I am more familiar with other forms of electronic music, as someone who has like a good intellectual knowledge of like what's happening in techno in Manchester in certain eras, or lots of electronic film scores, I suppose. This didn't sound so outside of what I'm familiar with. This is one of the first of its particular scene, I guess. But what I found here was lots of slowly developing sonorous, alternating between aggressive and beautiful orchestrations. Each track is epic in its own way, and building and multi-shifting and chimeric in its own way as well. What I found particularly impressive about this record is while every track is chimeric and shifts and changes so much, it still always sounds like it's like on brand for the song. Like it never feels like it's breaking the spell, I suppose. Especially the 25-minute closer out there somewhere, which is one of the most astonishing accomplishments I've ever heard. Just the way it layers sort of synth on synths and builds, and it's so tight and busy with since it feels so percussive while still being alien, but also still like harmonious and sonorous. There are points where it will drop out, leaving one synth line, like a band will drop out, like a rock band will drop out their instrumentation to leave a vocal line hanging. And it's incredibly satisfying. It brings in these strange warped, pitch-shifted wailing sounds, which it's not pitch-shifted in the way some people might be familiar with, where like, you know, you listen to like a Brockhampton song and it's shifted 2 octaves up. It's like shifting between semitones, warbling like that, you know?
I love this, Saoirse, because I have in my notes described it with exactly the same words, pitch shifted, as you.
Well, it's like, I remember when I used to go into like my school's music room, they had lots of keyboards everywhere and just fuck about. And one thing they had in the top left was a little wheel you could push up and down that would pitch shift it between semitones either side of the note. And it sounds like they've used that tool on this wailing. And they do it to extraordinary effect through chopping between individual snippets of the vocals. So you get a vocal that's shifted up there and then it'll stop and start down there again and come back up. And it's incredibly disorienting and interesting and very musically satisfying. And it builds to something that I found genuinely anthemic in its closing moments. I really found it incredibly satisfying. I also want to shout out the track. I don't know how to pronounce this because it's spelt in Welsh, but track 4.
Dwarf Buddha.
Thank you. Which the beat is so propulsive, and it's haunting and unsettling, and it brings in these synthesized strings, and it's just a really fascinating piece. Many times listening to this record, I actually thought of Portishead a couple of times, and the way they build these haunting soundscapes. This track is probably a good example of that. The opener is also a highlight for me. I love the way the beat sounds like a heartbeat at points. And it feels sort of vaguely nostalgic, but beautifully spacey. And the lead synth line is beautiful, if you can call it a lead synth line.
It sounds like a sunbeam in audio form. Like that's obviously the title of the track is "The Girl with the Sun in Her Head," but it sounds so radiant.
Yeah, no, it's such a great way to describe it. But really, I didn't know what to make of this record when I was going to. I didn't know what to expect from this record when I was going to listen to it, because the cover looks like it's on acid. And it's obviously from an era of electronic music composition I'm kind of unfamiliar with. But the more I listened to it, the more I realized, like, I kind of am familiar with this era of electronic music just by cultural osmosis of the things it influenced, I suppose.
And also, one of the reasons why I recommended this is that I think that in spite of its progressivism, in spite of how sweeping and lengthy a lot of these pieces are, this is a really accessible record, I think. Like, it's a really immediate one that I think most people will find, even if they don't have a lot of familiarity with acid techno or whatever, will find engaging and gripping because of how instantaneous the melodies are and how beautifully emotive it all sounds too.
Yeah, like if we're talking about the world, like we started off talking about the fact we've talked about IDM a lot on this show. And I think about albums like Hard Normal Daddy or some deep cuts on Drux specifically, or even Signed by Autechre, where it's like it's really delving into what can be done with sonic harmony and aesthetic beauty on these records. In this genre, and this felt like sort of that with but more divorced from the IDM scene, I guess, where it's just really beautifully composed and fascinating, but also just incredibly beautiful to listen to, I guess, and aesthetically beautiful, and I liked it very much.
I got a thing or two to say about Insides. Yeah, so I was obviously not entirely divorced from the kind of ambient acid techno scene this is coming out of. I've heard my share of like pre-Aphex Twin Richard D. James music under names like AFX, and some like Gas and Biosphere here or there. Both bands who are going for something kind of similar but not quite. This album starts off with kind of what sounds to me like the rotation of a giant industrial fan. And this is integral to how I interpreted this album, because earlier on the main record, Tyler mentioned a record we were discussing today that he described as like a clash between the natural and the technological. I thought he was referring to this album.
You're correct.
As it turned out. Oh, okay. Nice.
Well, also this record.
Nice.
Yeah.
Also this record, but okay, so the Paranormal record served as a good misdirect for that, but that is, to me, the core of what's going on here for sure. Like the girl with the sun in her head having this bright synthesizer, which leads us into the song proper against this stuttering electronic beat. And I mean, first thing to admire here is obviously the scope. 10 minutes, a long amount of time for 90s electronic music. It's not something you saw every artist doing on their records. So there's certainly a very interesting artistic intent to the length of these songs. And I love the way in this song in particular that the keyboards are really subtly mixed and they serve as this really nice complement to the main synthesizer here. Petrol's main synth sounds kind of like these chirping birds contrasted by this very heavy mechanical bass and drums. Petrol having this similar feeling of this battle between nature and things being organic. The box features some really groovy psychedelic influences, lots of heavy drone passages in this song, making the track very, very dizzying in a very exciting way. Dwarf Buddha, as I'll call it, takes this really hazy approach to its main synthesizer, which is countered by this really bouncy, playful beat. And that's something I do want to emphasize. This album is very playful in its composition and construction. It's trying to have a lot of fun. And I mean, that's something...
I think also that notion of like playfulness and all these different moving parts is like reflected in the cover art as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think you're spot on there. Yeah, and I think what adds to the intrigue of Dwarf Buddha is the kind of creepy voices you can hear in the back, and what's so captivating about these songs in particular, I think, is the interplay in the mixing and how things will shift up and down in the mix and be replaced by something entirely new, or something entirely new will be added. Rhythmic progression can easily slip right under your nose if you're not paying attention to it. But if you're paying attention to it, the evolution is just stunning to see unfold before you. Granted, I mean, this same kind of principal structure is used throughout this album on pretty much every song, but I don't see that as a criticism because it never gets boring. It's always consistently entertaining the way these tracks evolve and play around, that if can intellectualize, well, yeah, this is simply fun, doing it in new and interesting ways. It's like magic. And admittedly, there are some tracks like Adnan, I think, where I find this a little too janky. Like right around the 4-minute mark, there's a part where it feels like the song just stops for like a second and then continues with some new elements. But Adnan, regardless, is just a really nice, great, fun song in the track list. It's not really a low point. And then Out There Somewhere brings us to our vocal samples in the first 4 minutes of this track. A bit clunky. I didn't think they quite fit in place with the rest of the song. But the synthesizer is here that just wail for the first 7 minutes. Then they swell down as the whole song kind of comes to a gradual halt, but then it bursts right out with life at about the 8-minute 30-second mark. Is just one of the most stellar moments on this whole album. It is an absolutely memorable point. The song, though, is admittedly, because of its length, the only point in the album where I do consciously kind of register in my brain that I'm listening to loops. Like I can hear the same thing being played over and over again. And normally that's not a problem for me, but it's just here I happen register that, and it does take me out of it a little. And yeah, that could just be the runtime for me. But yeah, overall, I mean, it does cap off on a strong note for me. Like, I may not think this record ends as strong as it starts, but I think that instrumental motif of technology versus nature is very fascinating, because Insides actually, I believe, gives us a very optimistic answer to this clash, believing that nature will prevail, as shown in a lot of the playful, brighter synthesizers overtaking the darker, more industrial samples and noises. I think it's a very optimistic, interesting piece of 90s electronic music.
All right. Who else would like to chime into the discussion on this record? It's really just Jake and Morgan left.
He said that with such like comic anticipation, just like, yeah, it's just Jake and Morgan left, guys.
It's really just those two
What do you
nerds
think?
left.
Those two fucker. And look, I know you're probably not, or might not exactly hotly anticipating my opinion, seeing as I am notoriously allergic to house music. But you know, trepidation, and especially considering it's, I just looked at the runtime and was just like, fucking, what is it, an hour and 9 minutes long? So around 17 minutes.
Yeah.
So I was just like, okay, whoa, that's a lot. And also, you know, it was a little bit older, so I was just kind of like, you know, this isn't necessarily my game, so to speak, to begin with. It's not exactly like I cannot break things down in the way that you are going to, or the way that August necessarily did her. So yeah, going into it, I was just kind of like, and you know, much to my surprise, I really fucking like this. It's just so colorful and fun. It has these dizzying loops. It has this manic energy. It also has this like, I didn't really pick on to the fact that it has like that sort of organic versus technology thing going on in it, because I think I'm more so like, at least sound wise, while I was listening to it, and I think the heartbeat sort of probably put this idea in my head, and it made me like think about it a lot. But the way the album felt to me, and also just because of the cover being like it was, when I was listening to it, I was just kind of like, this feels definitely very like distinctly organic. I feel like I'm going through like a tour of like the interior of like and like an alien body. I feel like I'm going through and seeing like the vascular systems and like nervous systems and like muscles and tissues and interior organs of like some like cosmic being, because it's got all of these moments where it's just, again, that sort of like dizzying quality, but it also just has these kind of like really organic sounding, like throbbing sort of pulsing synths, and these like leads that are just so entrancing, so like active, that they sound kind of alive, that each part of this sounds like it's sort of just going at its own pace. It doesn't feel like planned necessarily. It just sort of feels like it happens, but not even like in a free jazz kind of way. It feels like distinctly weird and kind of meticulous. I like how you sort of have that really awesome colorful opener of the girl with the sun in her head, and I have a lot of fun with Petrol. The Box is this fucking huge, staggering track, and has this wonderful little like come down with and it sort of gives it this, yes, it sort of gives you that perfect pace. And that's what I think I admire most about the album, is really the structure. Is that like, I can't really speak to how the being conscious of the loops might affect my enjoyment of this. Maybe it's something that I would be a little bit more aware of if I listen to more music in the genre, and also its supposed datedness, which whether or not it contributes to like positively or negatively for you, this to me, again, not somebody who's super familiar with all of this, but like just the sound, the raw sound of it to me didn't sound dated at all. If you told me that this was from like 10 years in the future from where it was like actually released, I would be like, yeah, that sounds right. And I think it was just interesting going into this is because it's just like, you know, Tyler recommending an album like this, you know, your brain immediately goes to like, oh, it'll sound like Autechre. And it just goes to show you how different this shit is, because it's like, it's not as mechanical or industrial as Autechre's sounds tend to be, and even in their like more exploratory stuff later, when you get a little bit more organic, when you get into stuff like Oversteps or Sign or even Plus, it sounds nothing like that shit. It's worlds apart, really. And I think, again, I keep coming back to the word colorful, which is just the best way to describe it. It's also best demonstrated on the album, just the fucking mess that it is, even though I don't feel like this is a mess. I feel like another word tossed around a lot is progressive, just because of how many different movements and shifting parts this has. And I think that's pretty apt, at least by my definition of the word progressive, but it never feels unwieldy. It never feels like it's biting off more than it can chew, despite its weird, like very obvious ambition and its very, very like long track lengths. I don't know if this is just the streaming version, but like Tyler talked about how before we began, sort of some of the tracks are split into parts, like the box and the closer, but it's not technically the closer, because mine ends with a song called The Saint.
That's a bonus track.
Okay, as I didn't know what the deal was with that, but it wasn't marked. But I would also like to shout that out. I think that's a great moment, and it removes one of my problems with the album, is that I thought that Out There Somewhere was actually like, this just seems like a more fitting place to end everything. But now that I know that, I don't really have that to hold it against it. And I think that it's just like, this is, despite it being so like, it's got all this stuff that makes it kind of intimidating, like, if you gave this to me before I had started listening to things like Autechre or fucking Aphex Twin or fucking whatever, if you gave this to me and I managed to get over that fact, I would just be like, yo, this genre is way more like entertaining and weird and fun than I would have anticipated, because it's like, for as much as I love Autechre is very much like the best version of basically exactly the sound that you imagine that it is, and all the variants of that. But this is just so strange. It's like, if I can make the dumbest comparison here for just like music that like Tyler likes, is that if Autechre is XTC, this is Oingo Boingo. that sounds right in my head. I don't know how to relay that, but it does. I just think it's really fun.
Or maybe it's like, this is Oingo Boingo and Autechre's Cardiacs.
You know,
yeah.
That's
I think both of those make sense in my brain. So
yeah, it does to me too. There's just something about the eclectic nature of them and how like unabashedly kind of bouncy and weird they are, and I enjoy it very much.
Yeah, and you can see like why I recommended this, I think, because like this
Totally.
was not necessarily the album, but Orbital were the act that got me into electronic music. They, along with Kraftwerk, who were like the stuff I heard as a kid, that introduced me to that world, and then I could listen to the Aphex Twins and the Autechres and the Square Pushers and the etceteras as I got older, and as I was already had that foundation. And so I wanted to bring this album to you because I thought that it would, even though we've already kind of talked about lots of complicated esoteric IDM, this is a really good sort of foundation. As I said, it's super accessible, but also the main reason I recommended this album is that it's an electronic music album with the structure of a prog album. And I thought that would be an element that would appeal to people here. And
You were absolutely 100% correct in that. And honestly, like, you go back and listen to it, it does sound very like singular and stuff, but it's like, I did hear lots of, like, again, this is not a scene I know a lot about, but it's like, if this was influential on stuff like Square Pusher, I wouldn't be shocked, because there are moments on Ultra Visitor where it's just like, this sounds a lot like The Box, or this sounds a lot like Out There Somewhere Part 2. And I was just sort of like finding these little moments of just like, oh, I wonder if this maybe had like a tangential connection to that, because that feels like they might have some shared DNA, which also leads me to the question, what other Orbital albums should I listen to? Because I would really like to listen to these guys more.
Well, the cool thing about Orbital is that they've never been like a difficult act, for lack of a better word. Like their music is all really kind of quite easy to listen to,
Ooh,
and despite the fact that it has this kind of textural variety and stuff. I would recommend the Brown album, which is their second record. Has probably their most well-known song on it, and I also recommend, and particularly I want to recommend an album of theirs that's super underrated. It's the album they made right after Inside. It's called The Middle of Nowhere, and it has almost the exact same structure as Inside's, except it's a little more modest in comparison. It's much shorter, but it's a sort of 8-track thing. So those two albums I recommend. You can flip a coin as to which one you want to listen to. But they're both, I think, really, really strong as well.
Wait, they did the soundtrack to Pusher?
Yeah.
And what's that fucking movie?
They did one, Octane, I think, there's another one they did.
Well, they're like original
Makes a
Pusher, not the
weird
remake.
amount of sense.
They're also on the soundtrack to the movie Hackers as well.
Wow.
Wow.
I've seen
Event
Pusher, that makes
Horizon.
sense.
That's the other one they did.
Yeah. Event Horizon.
Okay, I've seen
What?
Pusher and Event Horizon, and that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Wow.
Very 90s,
Okay.
very 90s stuff.
Yeah.
Well, very
Yeah.
90s genre music, genre
Damn.
films, you know.
Yeah, I'm pleased you enjoyed it, Jake, because
Me too.
You're one of the people I wasn't sure about.
I also wasn't sure, so it was a very pleasant surprise to me as well.
But yeah, also on that note, Morgan, I'm very curious to hear what your experience with this record is and how you feel.
Well, what's the best way to put this? I want to start by saying that the record is definitely good. It's easy to see how formative it is in pretty much all of the ways that it is formative sentences. Its influence is felt far and wide, and it's pretty easy to hear that just from turning it on and listening to it once. That said, I feel like I'm at a disadvantage because I like skipped like 3 steps in the sort of 90s electronic music genre, because I just went balls deep right into Autechre. And something like this album would have been a little more sort of groundbreaking for me, whereas now I'm left with it just like, okay, yeah, it's like if you had grown up watching like Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street and like, just like Black Christmas, and then you go back and watch Psycho like a long time after that, you might be a little like, oh, this wasn't okay. Well, I mean, that was good, but like I don't know. I kind of seen it done better elsewhere. Which is very much the case with me and this album. My feelings on it are largely positive. The only thing I will say outright negatively is that it is, it's just, I can't lie, this thing's too fucking long. Which is funny because I think like the longest tracks are hands down my favorite. Which leaves me in a strange place, because on one hand I think the album is too long, and on the other, if you cut the things that make it that long to begin with, it's infinitely worse. It's just an awkward place to be. But yeah, stuff like Out There Somewhere which is just kind of breathtaking in its scope and the way it plays out. That's excellent. I think my favorite song on here is The Box. That's the one I find to be the most sonically interesting. I think for me, what really carries albums like this is just how enrapturing and engaging I find the sonic palettes to be. Something like The Box definitely scratches that itch, and parts on like Petrol don't so much, even though I can recognize that they're good. Um, yeah,
It's certainly a record that, while I find it to be super accessible and incredibly melodic at its core, like the core focus of this record is on melody, even though obviously the rhythms are super intricate and interlocking in a way that's quite satisfying as well. It's a very melodic record at its core, so that's why I think it's a really great step into this world. I'm definitely conscious of the fact that this is a record that, as I've already said at the start of this video, I'm conscious of the fact this is a record that does sound very 90s, but I think that kitsch and that quality is, I find it endearing. Maybe it is a product of the fact that I kind of grew up with it, and so it's always kind of felt like new and invigorating and interesting to me. But I find the, for lack of a better word, clunkiness of certain sounds in this record to be, I think, yeah, endearing is the right word for it. It just has this kind of almost innocent quality to it. At the same time, that almost feels kind of corrupted or corroded by some of the darker timbres on this record as well. But anyway, I think that it's a perfect record. Beyond perfect. This is like a 100 out of 100 album for me. Hopefully I can explain why I think it doesn't just sound great, but I think it's everything that a great album, like an all-timer great album, needs to be great. It begins, I love the way that it starts from almost silence. It begins with that heartbeat sound, and then that quickly becomes looped into this kind of percussive thump. And then you have, I love, it's a master class of construction, element by element here. You have these gently ringing, reverberating tones that are hanging on top of that heartbeat. And then about 1 minute and 15 seconds in, you get that ray of sunshine that defines the record, the gloriously bright synth bursts that just come and cascade through the emptiness. And then after a few iterations of that 2-note melody, you get the steady percussive rhythm that settles on top of it. One of the only rhythms on the record that actually sounds like real physical drums. You get this arpeggiated synth melody that adds to that build, and the construction's almost complete. This is The Girl with the Sun in Her Head, and I think this is one of the greatest opening tracks in all of electronic music. It feels like a grandiose statement of purpose. It's an arrival. It's this incredible achievement. I am in awe of it. It sounds enormous, and it is to the album's credit that it doesn't dwarf everything that follows, because it's such a gloriously bright and stunning piece of music. Despite having no discernible lyricism, this is a record that does have a consistent theme underpinning all of the tracks that is infused into the melodies and the arrangements, but is also transposed in a way that's elegant. It doesn't feel ham-fisted or overly blunt, even as the album's emotional evocations themselves are not exactly subtle. This is a record about the environment, almost a protest album in a certain sense. For instance, The Girl with the Sun in Her Head was recorded on equipment powered entirely by solar energy. The track Dwarf Buddha, that title is Welsh for dirty water, and was inspired by a massive oil spill off the coast of Wales in 1995, and the Hartnell brothers' desire to evoke the sensation of looking out at that through the sounds of the song. Perhaps the most bluntly urgent track on the record is Petrol, which sounds to me like an apocalyptic rave. I love the eerie looping electronic chirps that sit at the base of the track from the outset. They sound so kind of demented and inhuman. They almost sound like the mix is glitching. You have this absolutely doom-laden melody that ascends as this track builds to a gigantic finale. I could definitely see accusations of this song in particular being a little melodramatic, but I think that the grandiosity of it and the way that it builds is so in keeping with the rest of the record that it does fit, and it feels like it has its place, and it feels like perhaps the darkest or one of the darkest executions of this kind of despondent environmental theme on the record. The box is, like The Girl with the Sun in Her Head, another absolute masterpiece of musical construction. It begins gently, but like Girl with the Sun in Her Head, it builds in various sounds to a slowly escalating mix across its 12-minute runtime. The track was designed to evoke the sound and feel of music boxes, but also to evoke a sense of mystery, inspired by a recurring dream that Paul Hartnell had of a box that he could never open in his house. On top of all of that, the environmental theme also slots in neatly, as you can imagine, in like a Philip Glass, Koyaanisqatsi sort of way, that this is a musical evocation of the earth as this machine-like, relentlessly moving thing that's engineering its own destruction through people and their repeated microaggressions against the planet that are baked into our everyday life. I don't think it's pure projection to say that the musicality of this track clearly evokes all of these things. And Orbital's great strength is their ability to use both melody and texture to put these images and feelings in your head with a rigorous clarity. I love the way the second half of this track blossoms into a heaving, hulking beast with this disorienting melodic core that's veering across the stereo channels, and all of these interlocking percussive and rhythmic parts that are independently shining, but also building each other up in a really synergistic, blissful way that actually reminds me of all things of Ortekker's Garbage from the previous year. The last few minutes of this track are like nothing else, sheer bravura musical climax. Dwarf Buddha, as has been mentioned, is the most low-key and eerie track on the record, and I think this is the one that most rewards close attention. Its first half is this haunting and sparse combination of emotive strings, arpeggios, and the ghostly vocals of Alison Goldfrapp. And these hint at the more spacious and outward-reaching turn that I think the second half of this album takes relative to the first. If the first half of this album is a despairing overview of the Earth's decay, then the second half is a desperate plea to the stars for survival, for someone or something to come and save us. And this is not a new theme for the duo either. The Brown album's Impact is another incandescent banger in the same vein, complete with a vocal sample that literally includes the words "a cry for survival from the earth." Subtlety has never been the duo's strong point, but frankly, the urgency of Insides is, I think, what lends it its impact. The second half of Dwarf Buddha brings back the squelching electronic textures that are more familiar, and it turns the track into something stranger and more mechanical. In many ways, the progression of this song feels like a microcosm for the earth, beginning with these sounds that are soft, natural, organic, and then eventually having them subsumed and perverted by these disgusting, seedy synths and keys and percussive loops that feel like they're tripping over themselves, till by the end of the song, the returning vocal loop sounds almost twisted and disgusted, and the different combined components of the mix have kind of eaten themselves and left only a reverbed silence. In contrast to August, the track Adnans is my favorite song on the album. I love the rattling, looped percussive beat. I love the way it swings in the mix. It has a real unexpected swing to it that I think leads this track to stand out. I also love the way that on top of the swinging beat, you have these liquid sounds that sound like pouring oil, but they're also completely synthetic. And they actually, what's so beautiful about them is they have their own little looped rhythm, despite the fact that it just sounds like liquid running. I love the beeping melody that happens on top of this track. I love the synthetic string swell, and I love the beautifully bass heavy main melodic counterpoint that goes dun 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 dun. It's just a really great melody in the way that it moves around but always returns to home. It's very satisfying to listen to. My favorite detail of the song is the moaning, howling sounds on top of all of it that sound to me like a robot wolf howling at the moon. Every single sound in this dense mix is so beautiful to me. And I love the way it all rises and swells in synchrony. It feels really emotional to me. And I actually, again, in contrast to August, I love the part of this track towards the end where it kind of stops and you get this silence and then this new melody coming in that's just absolutely gorgeously textured. It sounds like stars. And then the entire mix eventually comes in behind it and you get this really rich climax to this song that feels so beautiful. I have memories of being a kid with a tiny little MP3 player and listening to this album, and like this song in particular, I have this vivid image of myself in the backseat of a car with my head on the window, watching the street lights and listening to this song. And to me, that kind of isolation, but also beauty is baked into the sound of it. And I could literally die listening to this and track and be happy. It's just that pretty to me. When that entire mix is just swelling at the end of it, I fucking lose it, man. It's so good. I also think at this point, it's worth mentioning that the duo's previous album, 1994's Snivelization, which is actually a strong album in its own right, even if it's a little bit uneven, definitely worth checking out if you like the band. But that album ended with 2 epic 15-minute tracks, 2 of the best songs they ever made. And in order to contextualize Out There Somewhere, I think that's worth mentioning, because Out There Somewhere synthesizes everything that's great about the classic era of Orbital, this ability to stretch these pieces out and build on them and let you kind of luxuriate in the mix for a while, is absolutely perfected on this track. I think it is the defining statement of all that they could do. It's divided into 2 clear halves on the CD version, but as a kid who grew up with the vinyl, it's always been this one gigantic monolith of a track to me. And I think what's really important to understand about unlocking the sound of this track is the heavy science fiction influence that's permeated Orbital's music, and I think is most visible here. This also may perhaps represent the stuff about their sound that might sound the most dated and cheesy to some people, but to me it's kind of schlocky and almost even camp in a way that's like awesome, the best way possible. The first 10 minutes of this track are intended to simulate the dying Earth's apocalyptic splendor, with those eerie vocals that cut in and out, representing the dying cries of people. And you get these ghostly wailed vocals as well that are Alison Goldfrapp back again. And they're just such a perfect little thing on top of it. And then the distorted wailing pitch-shifted synth that's already been mentioned that enters around 6 minutes in. To me, that represents like the wail of the earth itself to be saved, a kind of titanic and terrifying sound that always rattles me when I hear it, even though I know it's coming. As a kid, I remember I actually have a very specific memory of listening to this on cassette tape, actually, and hearing the sounds of this track at night when I couldn't sleep. It's just one of those childhood fixtures. It felt like then, and it still sounds like a wailing nightmare. If it's kitschy and corny and clunky, then it's those things in the same way as classic sci-fi from the 40s and 50s. It's that in the same way that Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast is, which I feel very strongly must have influenced the sound of this track. However, around the 10-minute mark, as the track shifts into its second part, you get this notable change. Suddenly the tone shifts in almost a very dramatic way to something that's much more grandiose and optimistic. Paul Hartnell says this is meant to represent the arrival of aliens to rescue the survivors of the burning Earth, but that it's designed to sound more like fantasy than reality. The last 14 minutes of Out There Somewhere are less a magnificent rescue than a final dream of utopia, or even a vision of some glorious afterlife where the fires have stopped and you're instead falling through a colossal interstellar amphitheater, millions of light years wide. I also love how August described this as well, as almost as this optimistic ending where it seems like nature is winning out. And I feel like you can read it in that way as well, as though the first 10 minutes are the dying of all of the pestilence and the negativity and the stuff that's brought about the Earth's downfall. And then the rest of the track is like a glorious rebirth. And I just think that sounds so awesome. And so it's very difficult to do a conceptual electronic record where the concept comes through clearly, I think, and where you can see it imbued in the sounds of the record without it feeling like the music is trying too hard to evoke certain scenes. It's not a subtle album, as I said, but I think it's a record where the emotions, the way you're supposed to feel, and maybe some of the imagery are quite clear from the experience of listening to it. And it's an absolute triumph in that regard. It sounds great to me. It is really cohesive. There's not a single weak moment on it, I don't think. It's a moment where every single piece interlocks. I love the way that the structure of the two halves is almost complementary. And the vinyl, it's split in the vinyl, it's a double LP with a girl and Petrol on the first side, the box on the second side, Dwarf Buddha and Adnan's on the third side, and out there's someone on the fourth side. And that's just like that's seeing it in that way, I think really highlights the genius of the way this whole thing is put together, to have these various moments on the record that swell and complement other moments on the record. It's just such a cohesive, holistic vision of a record. And it's seldom that you get something that's that accomplished in terms of structure and meaningful in terms of every single sound and what it's doing. And I think that this record does it better than maybe almost any other record of its kind. It's such a totemic thing to me. It will always be. And I think that it's unparalleled in for all of those reasons. And I'm pleased that you've all enjoyed it to various degrees anyway, because I think I think of it as the best kind of introduction into this kind of world. And I think of it as I come back to that thing that I said before, where it's like an electronic music album with a progressive structure. And it's not just that it's progressive in the sense that there are long tracks that have these different parts, but also in the sense that they're all unified around a theme, in the same way that themes are so vital to progressive rock and progressive genres of music as well. It feels of a piece with that, even if the songs are less comparatively shifting than something like a Mars Volta record or whatever. It has the same sense of purpose and unity. And that's why I think it's one of the best albums ever made.
Yeah, just for into rating, so I want to share with you something I've just discovered about this band this minute, right?
Okay.
So, if I'm here, right, this is where I live, this is Orpington, my town. I mentioned in the other episode recorded today, Bowie grew up in Bromley, which is 10 minutes this way.
Yeah.
Kate Bush was from Bexley Heath, which is about 30 minutes this way. This band Orbital are from Sevenoaks, where I used to work in the cinema, which is another 10 minutes this way. They used to work in the cinema there.
Awesome.
See, this is what I'm saying. Your island is tiny.
Yeah.
It's small.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
So Orbital are great. It seems like in a certain sense this record kind of overshadows their other ones and sort of general consensus. And this is a band that I think a lot of young people maybe aren't even necessarily aware of. Again, because it's kind of quite kitschy in a certain way that maybe turns some people off. But I think once you kind of immerse yourself in this era more and more, it becomes clearer what a cut above this particular album is. And Orbital were such a fixture of my childhood in terms of like learning about music and learning and listening to stuff that I kind of drifted away from them a while as I kind of grew up, because I just saturated myself with them so much. But coming back to them now, it's such a great feeling to see that the stuff that I took from that music as a kid is stuff that I still see, and if anything is enhanced by being older and understanding music more. And yeah, I think this is basically as good an example of that as anything. Yeah, I'm thanks for a good conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Favorite tracks and ratings, shall we move on to?
Yeah. Jake, lead us off.
Oh boy. My favorite tracks are gonna say The Box part. Well, no, just The Box because it's not parts. I'll say Out There Somewhere and The Girl with the Sun in Her Head. Least favorite, I'll say Petrol, and I'll give it an 8.5.
Nice.
Right. Favorite tracks myself are The Girl with the Sun in Her Head, The Box, and Dwarf Buddha. Least favorite, probably Adnan's. Not that there is a track, I think, too considerably weaker than anything else here. 8 out of 10. Good record.
Nice. Fuck yes. Fuck yes. The August 8th. Let's fucking go.
I
The way I
it's just-
feel
it's
that.
like it's like we didn't even have to show up. This is him and August. That's all we needed. My 3 favorite tracks are motherfucking The Box, Out There Somewhere, Dear. Least favorite, I'll also go Petrol. I'm gonna say a 6.5 for this one.
Saoirse.
Okay, my favorite tracks are
See, that was dumber. I made it dumber. Carry on.
you're welcome. My favorite tracks are The Girl with the Sun in Her Head, Dwarf Buddha, Dark Porter. I love that Mark Ruffalo film.
It's actually dirty water, but I'll let you have the joke.
Thank you. And I'm gonna get this record an 8 out of 10.
Okay.
Tyler.
My 3 favorite tracks are in no particular order, in the order of the album. The Girl with the Sun in Her Head, The Box, and Adnan's do not have a least favorite track. This is a 10 out of 10 album for me.
Nice, dude. So that's an average of 8.2, which lines up with, get this, Orteca's plus everything's Reanimator and the Hotelier. It never goes out.
Let us know at home what you think of Orbital. What is your relationship with Orbital? What do you think of Insides? If not this record, what is your favorite Orbital record? And if you have a relationship with the band's music, let us know. Did we do it justice? Yeah, next week is Jake's recommended record, which is
Ghosteen.
Oh shit, it is too.
My relationship with Orbital is that bitch cheated on me.
All right.
And on that note, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Pokemon, gotta catch 'em all.